What if, deep in the mountains of West Virginia, you stumbled upon a village that doesn't appear on any map, a place where everyone who entered was never seen again? It began in the fall of 2023, when a small research team from Huntington University set out on what was supposed to be a routine ethnographic expedition. Their goal was to study remnants of early Appalachian communities, settlements that, according to historical records, were abandoned centuries ago. The team was led by Dr. Thomas Avery, a 52-year-old cultural anthropologist known for his work on isolated mountain groups. Alongside him were Sarah Whitlock, a 27-year-old graduate student with a passion for folklore, and Daniel "Danny" Miller, a quiet but sharp-eyed documentary photographer. They were drawn to a strange marking on an old Civilian Conservation Corps map from the 1930s. In a remote valley on the border of Randolph County, near the dense Monongahela National Forest, there was a symbol, a tiny dot, and the faint word Elder's Hollow. The name didn't appear in any census data, no postal records, nothing. To the academic world, it was a blank spot. But for local hunters, it was something else entirely. "You don't go up there," one of the older men at a roadside diner told them. "Dogs won't follow you. Birds don't sing. Folks that wandered in never made it back down." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were talking about the weather. Avery and his team chalked it up to local superstition. Appalachian ghost stories were a dime a dozen. Still, something about the man's tone lingered with Sarah. The group hired a seasoned local guide, Eli Harmon, to lead them along the forgotten logging trails that cut through the dense autumn forest. Eli had lived in those mountains all his life. His grandfather had worked in the logging camps before the war, and he knew the terrain like the back of his weathered hands. The first 2 days went smoothly. The air was crisp, the map matched the terrain, and they even found remnants of old cabins, little more than collapsed beams and moss-covered stones. But on the third morning, as they approached a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the mountains, Eli suddenly stopped. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice low. Avery frowned. "What do you mean?" "We're less than a mile from the valley." Eli's face had gone pale. "I told you I'd get you this far. I ain't going any closer. My father warned me about that hollow. Said the woods there watch." Sarah tried to press him for details, but Eli refused to say more. He turned back without another word and disappeared into the trees. That night, they made camp just off the trail. The forest was unnaturally silent. No crickets, no owls. Just the sound of their own breathing and the distant rush of a creek somewhere below. Danny joked nervously about deliverance, trying to lighten the mood, but no one laughed. Sometime past midnight, Sarah awoke to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Slow, deliberate steps circling their campsite. She called out softly, assuming it was Eli checking on them. There was no reply. She unzipped the tent flap and shone her flashlight into the darkness. Nothing but trees and swirling mist. In the morning, Eli was gone. His tent was empty, his pack still there, his boots missing. There were no footprints leading away. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. They were now alone, at the edge of a forgotten valley that didn't officially exist, and something in those woods was already watching. A gray morning mist rolled through the trees like something alive, curling around trunks and seeping into the folds of their jackets. The old trail narrowed into little more than a deer path, hemmed in by thick undergrowth and gnarled roots that seemed to clutch at their boots with every step. The air grew colder, heavier, and Sarah swore she could smell something beneath the damp autumn scent. A faint rot, like wet wood and something far older. No birds called. No leaves rustled, though the trees stood tall and still like silent sentinels. The deeper they went, the more the forest pressed in on them, muting their voices until even whispered conversations seemed to hang unnaturally in the air. "We should have found the creek by now," Danny murmured, glancing at his GPS. The signal was fading in and out, the little blue dot freezing, jumping, then vanishing altogether. "Keep going," Avery said, his voice lower than usual. "According to the topography, the valley should be just ahead." They pushed through a curtain of overgrown laurel and stepped out onto a narrow ridge. Below them, the mist opened like a stage curtain, revealing a hidden basin carved deep between the Appalachian slopes. And there it was. Nestled in the heart of the hollow stood a small village, a cluster of wooden cabins, maybe 40 or 50 in total. They were built in a crude but familiar 19th century Appalachian style. Pitched roofs, rough-hewn walls, smoke chimneys. But something about it was wrong. From above, it looked less like a collection of houses and more like a single tangled organism. Structures leaning into one another, walls fused by time and neglect, roofs overlapping as if the village had grown on its own, without human hands to guide it. The dirt paths between buildings twisted in unnatural loops, converging on a central square dominated by a strange, tall structure, too far away to make out clearly. "It's not on any map," Sarah whispered, as if afraid the village might hear her. The place looked abandoned at first glance. Windows were shuttered. No figures moved through the narrow lanes. But then they noticed details that made the hair on the back of Danny's neck stand up. Thin lines of smoke curling lazily from a few chimneys. Fresh laundry hung on ropes between buildings, gently swaying in the windless air. "This isn't deserted," Avery muttered. They descended carefully into the valley, following what remained of an old logging road. As they got closer, the strange layout became even more disorienting. Buildings were crammed together at odd angles, some joined by narrow wooden bridges overhead. It felt less like they were walking into a settlement and more like stepping inside the ribs of some sleeping creature. Sarah slowed, glancing toward one of the windows. For just a moment, she saw something. A movement, quick and deliberate, like a curtain being pulled back. Her skin prickled. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Danny raised his camera, but the lens immediately fogged over. He wiped it, tried again, but the viewfinder showed nothing but warped glass and mist. They stopped in the center of what must have been the main lane, surrounded by wooden facades that loomed above them, tilting inward. The silence here was different, not empty, but watchful. It pressed in from every direction, thick and expectant, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Avery adjusted his backpack, trying to sound confident. "Let's find someone to talk to. There has to be a reason this place isn't marked." But no one came out. No doors opened. Only the faint smell of damp earth and smoke hung in the air. And then Sarah felt it, a distinct, crawling awareness at the back of her neck. She didn't hear anything. She didn't see anything. But every instinct told her they weren't alone. They were just about to turn back toward the ridge when a door creaked open somewhere behind them. The sound was sharp in the heavy silence, like a snapped twig in a crypt. From the shadows of a narrow alley between two leaning cabins, a figure emerged, small, bent, wrapped in layers of dark, earth-stained shawls. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes milky yet disturbingly alert. She moved slowly, leaning on a stick carved with strange, looping symbols that neither Sarah nor Danny recognized. "Strangers," she rasped. Her voice carried a lilting, almost musical accent, but it was tangled with archaic phrases, as if she were speaking some forgotten Appalachian dialect layered with something older still. "You've come from the outside." Avery stepped forward cautiously. "We're researchers from the university. We're here to learn about this place, about your history." The old woman tilted her head, her thin lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. History? She repeated, almost amused. No, there is no history here. There is only family. The way she pronounced the last word, drawn out, reverent, made Sarah's stomach tighten. The woman turned without waiting for a reply and gestured for them to follow. Her pace was slow but steady, her stick tapping against the warped wooden boards like a metronome. They exchanged uneasy glances, but Avery nodded. "We need to understand who they are," he whispered. As they followed her deeper into the village, the labyrinthine layout seemed to close around them. Windows opened a crack as they passed. Shutters shifted. Sarah could feel eyes on them, dozens, maybe more, though she couldn't spot a single face. They reached the central square, where the tall structure they'd seen earlier rose above them like a distorted church steeple. The old woman lifted her stick. "Here is where we gather," she said. "But before you step inside, you must follow our law." She pointed at Danny's camera and Sarah's recorder. "No pictures, no voices stolen. What is ours stays with us." Avery hesitated, but finally lowered his equipment. Danny switched off the camera. As they complied, more figures appeared silently in doorways and behind half-closed shutters. Men, women, children, all standing utterly still, watching. Sarah's breath caught. Their faces, they were different people, but their features were eerily alike. The same deep-set eyes, the same elongated jawlines, the same blank, patient expressions. It was like walking through a hall of living copies. And for the first time, Sarah realized this wasn't just an isolated village. It was a single, breathing entity, and it had just noticed them. The longer they stayed in the square, the more the villagers emerged. Slowly, silently, like shadows peeling themselves away from the walls. No one spoke. No one smiled. They simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, their heads tilting ever so slightly in perfect unison, as if responding to an invisible signal. Danny's fingers tightened around his camera strap. Even without lifting the lens, he could see it now. They all looked the same. Not just related, but eerily, disturbingly identical. The same narrow, deep-set amber-tinted eyes. The same elongated cheekbones. Even the way they blinked seemed synchronized. Avery tried to keep his tone neutral. "We'd like to speak with someone in charge. A leader, perhaps?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not speech, but a low, humming resonance that seemed to pass from throat to throat like a current. Finally, the old woman tapped her stick twice on the ground. The humming stopped instantly. "They will come," she said simply. "The elders always come." As they waited, Sarah's gaze drifted across the villagers. A group of children stood near one of the cabins, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. Their movements were the most unsettling of all. Every turn of the head, every shift of weight was mirrored perfectly, like puppets controlled by the same unseen strings. The smell of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit, hung in the air. She felt the weight of their stares pressing against her skin. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. Then, from the far end of the square, 3 figures appeared. Elderly, draped in heavy coats stitched from animal hides. Their faces bore the same unsettling features but deeper, more defined, like older versions of the same template. They walked in perfect step, their canes striking the ground in rhythm. The villagers parted for them without a single word. Avery swallowed hard. "This isn't just isolation," he whispered to Sarah. "This is controlled evolution." The 3 elders stopped before them. One of them, a tall man with skin like old parchment, raised his chin. "You wish to understand," he said, his accent thick and unfamiliar. "Then you will listen." and you will not forget. Their words carried the weight of something older than history, and as their voices echoed through the warped square, Sarah realized that this village wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. The three elders led them toward the tall wooden structure at the center of the square. Up close, Sarah could see it wasn't a church, though it bore the skeletal outline of one. The walls were carved with intricate patterns, not crosses or familiar religious icons, but interwoven human figures, their limbs spiraling together in a tangled mass, like roots of an ancient tree. "This is where family begins," the tall elder said, his voice like gravel rolling down a mountain, "and where family endures." Inside, the building smelled of smoke, damp earth, and something metallic. The ceiling was low, the space lit by tallow candles that flickered weakly, throwing long shadows across the carvings. In the center stood a stone platform stained dark with age. Avery whispered to Sarah, "Looks like a gathering hall. Maybe ceremonial." The elder turned sharply, as if hearing the whisper, and smiled without warmth. "Yes," he said. "Ceremony. Always ceremony. Since the first winter." The old woman from earlier shuffled closer, lifting her stick like a storyteller ready to begin. Her cloudy eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Our beginning," she said, "was not like yours." She told them a story, one passed down through countless generations. In the late 1700s, 7 families fled into these mountains, escaping persecution and famine. They found the hollow by following a man, a stranger who had appeared from beyond the ridge, speaking a language no one knew. His name, they said, was Elias Vaughn. Elias promised safety if they obeyed his one command. No one leaves, no one enters. The blood must stay one. At first, they lived together peacefully. But over the years, disputes arose, and 6 of the families left, returning to the outside world. Only Elias's family remained. He gathered his children, 3 sons and 4 daughters, and laid down the law. They would marry among themselves. Their blood would remain pure. "And so," the old woman said, tapping the floor, "the family was born." Over the next 2 centuries, the practice continued generation after generation. Marriages between cousins, siblings, uncles, and nieces. Every birth was meticulously recorded, every union planned. Outsiders who stumbled in were given a choice: join the family or become part of the earth. Sarah's stomach churned as she imagined what that meant. The elder's voice grew almost reverent as he continued. "We became closer, closer than any of you can understand. Our faces aligned. Our blood remembered itself. Weakness left us. Only strength remained." Sarah caught a flicker of something dark in his expression. Pride. Avery asked carefully, "What about illness? Genetic defects?" The elder's smile widened. "The weak return to Elias early. The marked ones remain. They see what others cannot. They lead us." She noticed how some villagers, especially the ones lurking near the back, had more pronounced deformities. Elongated limbs, twisted spines, oversized eyes that glimmered amber in the candlelight. They weren't shunned. They were revered. "And this structure?" Danny finally asked, nodding toward the platform. "This," the elder said, placing a bony hand on the stone, "is where blood is joined, where pairs are chosen, where the family grows stronger." The humming began again, low, resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. Sarah felt it in her ribs. It wasn't just a sound. It was a pulse. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't simply an isolated community with strange customs. It was a living, breathing blood cult, sustained across centuries, its beliefs carved into flesh as much as into wood. Sarah woke to silence. Not the soft, natural quiet of a forest, but a heavy, pressed silence, like the world outside the tent had stopped breathing. Her watch showed 12:47 a.m. A pale slice of moonlight cut across the canvas, and a faint rhythmic hum threaded through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the village. She hesitated, then slowly unzipped the tent flap. Cold air rushed in, carrying a smell she couldn't quite place. Damp soil, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. She slipped out, pulling her jacket tight, and crept toward a cluster of rocks at the edge of the square. From her hiding spot, she had a clear view of the House of Union. Figures were emerging from doorways one by one. Not the entire village, but the marked ones. She recognized them by their twisted silhouettes. Elongated limbs, crooked spines, faces with unnatural symmetry broken only by their deformities. They moved with an insect-like precision, their shadows jerking across the dirt as if each body was part of a larger organism. No one spoke. Instead, the humming deepened, a low, resonant sound that seemed to rise not from their throats but from the ground itself. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest. She could feel it. The vibrations traveled through the soil, into her bones, rattling something deep inside her. The marked gathered around the stone platform, forming concentric rings, their heads tilted back in perfect unison. The humming changed pitch, layering into something that was neither music nor language, a sound that made her vision blur at the edges. For a moment, she thought the air itself was pulsing. The candles in the House of Union flickered, then flared, casting warped shadows that crawled across the ground like black tendrils. Then she felt it, presence, standing directly behind her. Her skin went cold. She didn't dare turn around. She could hear it, slow, wet breathing just inches from her neck. Her fingers dug into the rock to keep from screaming. Below, the ritual reached a feverish intensity. The marked were swaying now, their movements synchronized like the beating of one enormous heart. The humming had become a physical force, vibrating through the earth, through her body, through the night. And as Sarah crouched in the shadows, she understood. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a communion. The following afternoon, the elders summoned them without words. A single knock on their cabin door, and the old woman stood outside, wrapped in the same dark shawls, her milky eyes catching the pale light. "Come," she said. "It is time to see what no outsider sees." They followed her along a narrow, overgrown trail that wound around the back of the valley. The air grew colder, the forest denser. Moss-covered boulders formed strange, natural arches overhead. Eventually, the trail ended at the base of a hill. There, almost invisible beneath tangled roots and stones, was a small, black opening. "This place," the woman whispered, her voice reverent, "is not for strangers, but he wishes you to see." She lit a small lantern and led them inside. The passage was narrow, the air damp and heavy with a sweet, metallic odor that made Sarah's stomach turn. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the cave itself were inhaling. The tunnel opened into a low, circular chamber carved entirely by hand. Dozens of candles burned in clay holders, their wax spilling down the walls like pale vines. Symbols were etched into every surface, looping, sharp-edged glyphs unlike any written language Avery had ever seen. He leaned closer to one of the walls. "This isn't Latin, not Cherokee, not anything I've studied. It is his tongue," the old woman said softly. "The language of Elias. Only the marked can read it." Then Sarah saw it. At the center of the chamber stood a stone platform. Upon it rested a body, tall, wrapped in dark, decaying fabrics, its head covered by a carved wooden mask inlaid with amber. Bowls filled with a thick, dark liquid surrounded the platform, arranged in a precise, almost ritualistic pattern. The smell was strongest here, iron and rot, laced with herbs. The old woman lifted her lantern higher. "Behold the Father," she whispered. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached up and removed the mask. Sarah's breath caught. The face beneath was not skeletal. It wasn't even fully desiccated. The skin, gray and waxy, clung to the bone but retained an eerie elasticity. The brow was too prominent, the jaw unnaturally long, the proportions subtly wrong, human and yet not. The closed eyelids were smooth and intact, as if the figure could wake at any moment. Avery took a step closer, drawn in despite himself. "This can't be 200 years old," he whispered. "The preservation." The elder cut him off. "He does not rot. He endures. He drinks our blood, and we drink his wisdom." She gestured toward the bowls. "Every new moon the marked come here. They offer. He speaks through the blood." Danny swallowed hard, his camera long forgotten. "You mean, this is Elias Vaughn?" The elder nodded. "The first. The one who showed us the way." Sarah stared at the strange face on the stone, at the amber inlaid in the mask now resting beside it, at the looping runes that climbed the walls like vines. The hum she'd heard the night before seemed to vibrate faintly in the stone beneath her feet. In that cold, candlelit chamber, surrounded by unreadable symbols and the preserved body of a man who looked not quite human, one thought lodged itself in her mind. They weren't just preserving their history. They were worshipping something ancient, something that might not be entirely dead. By the time they returned from the cave, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. No one spoke over dinner. Even Avery, usually the calm anchor, stared blankly at the fire, his mind spinning. "We're leaving," he finally said. "At first light. No more discussions." Danny nodded immediately. Sarah didn't argue. She couldn't get the image of that preserved face out of her head. The smooth eyelids, the jaw that seemed almost ready to move. They packed quietly that night, careful not to attract attention. But something in the air had shifted. The village no longer felt merely watchful, it felt aware. Around 3 a.m., Sarah jolted awake. A sound had risen in the distance. Not the low humming of the ritual, but something sharper. Bells? No. Wooden clappers. A rhythmic knocking that echoed through the valley like a heartbeat. She crawled to the flap of her tent and froze. The entire village was awake. Lights flickered in every window. Figures moved through the narrow lanes in eerie synchronization, gathering in clusters, then splitting again with insect-like precision. "Tom!" she hissed, shaking Avery awake. "They're moving." Within minutes, all three were outside with their packs. The square was filling with people. The marked appeared first, their silhouettes unmistakable, limbs warped and elongated. Their mouths were stretched into strange, gleeful smiles, revealing teeth that seemed too many, too crowded, like something human trying too hard to mimic joy. At the center of the square stood the old woman. Her shawl whipped in the cold wind. Her voice carried clearly through the night. "He has felt you," she called. "Your blood is not like ours. It is strong. He wants to taste it." The villagers began to close in, step by step, their movements perfectly synchronized. There was no shouting, no chaos, just a tightening human ring. "Go!" Avery whispered. They turned and ran. Branches whipped against their faces as they plunged into the woods, the path barely visible in the thin moonlight. Behind them, the villagers didn't scream, they followed. And somehow, Sarah knew they didn't need light. Every time she dared glance back, she saw shadows slipping between trees, moving silently but with terrifying speed. She tried to listen for footsteps, but there was nothing, only the pounding of her own heart. "They know where we are," Danny gasped. "How?" "They hear us," Sarah whispered. "Not with their ears." They zigzagged through the forest, but the sense of pursuit never faltered. It was as if the entire valley itself was tracking them, guiding their hunters through the dark. At one point, Avery motioned for them to stop and crouch behind a fallen log. They held their breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, out of the darkness, shapes began to gather, villagers moving toward them in complete silence, heads turning in perfect unison. "They're not searching," Sarah realized. "They're knowing." Panic broke through their thin veneer of control. They bolted again. Hours blurred into a desperate, stumbling flight through the endless forest. Then, just as the horizon began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Sarah heard it, rushing water. They burst through the trees and found themselves on the rocky bank of a fast-moving river. The instant their feet hit the shore, something shifted. The forest behind them fell silent. The shadows stopped at the tree line. The villagers stood among the trunks, motionless, their faces expressionless now, the two wide smiles gone. "They're not crossing," Danny whispered. Avery stared at them for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "They've never needed to." As the sun rose over the ridge, painting the water in pale gold, the villagers slowly turned away, all at once, and melted back into the forest. For the first time in days, Sarah exhaled. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't escape. It was only delay. They stumbled into the nearest town just after sunrise. Exhausted, filthy, half in shock. The local sheriff listened to their story with the skeptical politeness reserved for lost hikers and drunk campers. But when Avery handed him the GPS coordinates and insisted on returning with a full search team, the sheriff hesitated only a moment before calling for backup. By afternoon, 2 patrol cars and a handful of deputies accompanied them back up the logging roads. The sun was high, the forest bright and almost peaceful, as if the nightmare had been a fever dream. But when they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Elder's Hollow was gone. No cabins, no smoke, no laundry lines swaying in the still air. Just an empty basin filled with tangled undergrowth, as if the forest had swallowed the village whole overnight. Even the trail that had led them down was gone, replaced by a slope of untouched earth and ferns. They combed the area for hours. Nothing. The only sign that something had changed was the forest itself. Unnaturally quiet, devoid of birds, and scattered with abandoned burrows and nests, as if every animal had fled. Danny pulled out his camera, desperate to prove what they'd seen. But the images were wrong. Entire sequences were blurred beyond recognition. Others were streaked with light flares, warped shapes, distorted shadows. One picture of the House of Union showed nothing but a gray smear, like someone had dragged a wet brush across the lens. "This isn't a malfunction," Danny muttered. "It's like it didn't want to be recorded." Over the following weeks, their lives began to unravel in quiet, insidious ways. Sarah started waking up from vivid, synchronized dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but shared visions of the valley, the marked ones, the hum vibrating through her skull. She swore she could hear whispers in a language she didn't know. Danny reported seeing figures in reflections in windows, mirrors, the corners of his phone camera, always standing just behind him. Avery found himself blacking out for minutes at a time, only to discover strange symbols scrawled across his notebooks in handwriting that wasn't his. Out of desperation, Sarah underwent genetic testing as part of a routine medical checkup. The results were inconclusive at first. Then the lab requested a second sample, and a third. When the final report came, Her doctor stared at the papers in disbelief. "There are anomalies in your DNA," he said slowly. "Sections that don't match any known mutation. They weren't there in your records from last year." She didn't tell him about the cave, or the blood, but deep down she knew the truth. They hadn't escaped Elder's Hollow. They had brought it with them. The unraveling happened slowly at first, like hairline cracks spreading through glass. Danny was the first to disappear. One morning he simply didn't show up for work. His car was found parked near the edge of Monongahela Forest. Keys still inside, camera missing. The sheriff's search turned up nothing. Friends said he'd been acting strange, talking about voices in the static and faces in reflections. Avery lasted longer, but the pressure fractured him in different ways. After a series of violent night terrors and an incident in which he was found wandering the streets barefoot, muttering in an unrecognizable language, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for observation. Doctors couldn't explain the symbols he carved into his own arms with a pen cap, loops and sharp angles eerily similar to the cave runes. Sarah was alone now, but she couldn't escape it either. Every night the dreams returned. The hum, the synchronized movements, the feeling of being part of something vast and alien. She stopped sleeping. She stopped trying to convince herself it wasn't real. Meanwhile, the mystery deepened. Satellite imagery of the valley where Elder's Hollow once stood began circulating in niche online forums. Every single image was corrupted, blurred, pixelated. No matter the season, no matter the resolution, the same anomaly appeared. A soft gray smear over several square miles, as if reality itself refused to be captured. Then came the sightings. It started in nearby Appalachian towns. A woman at a gas station claimed to have seen a man with amber eyes staring at her from the tree line at night. A trucker reported a group of people walking along a remote stretch of highway in perfect lockstep, vanishing into the woods when approached. Within months, the reports spread across the country. Philadelphia, St. Louis, Denver, always the same description. Pale faces, identical features, unnatural synchronization. Sarah saw them too. On the subway, in the reflection of an office window, across the street at 3 a.m., standing perfectly still watching, and each time something inside her stirred. Not fear, recognition. She began to wonder if this was how it started for them. Centuries ago, a few wanderers, a few carriers, a bloodline quietly threading itself through the fabric of the world. The humming in her head never stopped now. Some nights, when the city was quiet, she could almost understand the words. If you see familiar faces in the crowd, if you catch the glint of amber eyes, if you hear the blood's call. Sarah stared into her bathroom mirror, her own irises glowing faintly in the dim light. Will you be able to resist? The world was shifting, and Elder's Hollow was only the beginning.